This is lecture number DR010US04. This is the 10th of the Mega Genius lectures and the 4th lecture of the Uncommon Sense series. It was recorded on November 16th, 2000. The title of this lecture is The Solution to Crime. It is 31 minutes long. Copyright 2000 by Mega Genius. All rights reserved. This lecture is protected by internationally valid copyright. It may not, in whole or in part, be duplicated, transmitted, or otherwise reproduced without the express permission of Mega Genius. Unauthorized translation, importation, or distribution is a violation of applicable laws. Mega Genius is a United States federally registered trademark and service mark. And now, here is Mega Genius.
Here is a mega truth. Punishment results solely from one's own inability to control another. Have you ever punished another or been punished yourself? Frankly, it's always an act of barbarism, and therefore is quite different from discipline, which is an act of teaching by instruction or exercise. The intent of discipline is to help. Through proper discipline, control is established and a person is made more able and, consequently, happier. Conversely, the intent of punishment is to inflict suffering, pain, or loss, which serves as retribution. Punishment does not promote understanding. It promotes pain. The lesson to be learned by one who is punished is to be more covert, so as not to be caught so easily in the future. So, while discipline is intended to help, punishment is intended to hurt. The intent is opposite. That's why we cultivate self-discipline, but reserve punishment for others. There is also a consequential relationship between these opposites, which is that punishment follows inadequate discipline. When discipline is ineffectively applied, punishment comes to bear as an irrational attempt to regain control. For example, if a person could intelligently think of a workable way to persuade a child to always act properly, he would never resort to punishment. Unfortunately, the parent is usually too overwhelmed by anger to think clearly. Of course, if we concluded that everyone who has ever punished another is no more than an uncaring barbarian, we would commit a serious error. It is true, however, that anyone who has administered punishment after discipline failed was acting barbarously at the moment, as a last resort. Now we are approaching one of the darker secrets of punishment. No one was ever punished because of what he did. He was punished solely because another person was motivated by anger. That may be difficult to accept, but it's a fact. That's why calm people seek to establish good control and assist others, while angry people seek to inflict injury and obtain some semblance of satisfaction through vengeance. Punishment is always the act of an angry individual or an angry society. In the full light of reasoning, it's an unrefined act by one who failed to establish or maintain control of another, could not accept responsibility for his own failure, and, in anger, blamed the other party and sought to inflict injury upon it. The angrier one becomes, the less sense he makes. In truth, the way to maintain control of another begins with maintaining control of oneself and one's emotions. Now we see punishment happening at all strata of the human race, by individual to individual and by nation to nation. So, while we may not know if or when mankind will vaporize himself in the crust of spaceship Earth in some ill-conceived thermonuclear solution to his inability to maintain order with his own kind, if he makes that choice, we will at least know why. It will be because he failed to control another, became angry at his inability, could not accept responsibility for his own failure, blamed the other party, directed his anger toward the other party, and expressed it through force. Force, or the threat of force, is an inherent part of punishment. The close association between the two is why many people have an automatic revulsion at just the thought of force. They contemplate murder, rape, armed robbery, assault, kidnapping, bombing, and the like, and conclude that the use of force is bad. It is not necessarily. Force is also required to build automobiles, highways, airplanes, and homes, to grow food, to eliminate garbage, and even to play sports. It literally makes the world turn, and that's good. So what exactly is the trouble with force, basically? The genius formula reveals that any time you have ever felt compelled to resort to the use of force against another person without his consent, you have failed in your attempt to maintain control. Even if one foiled an attempted assault in one's own home by an act of forceful self-defense, despite having survived, he has failed to maintain control sufficient to ensure that he was safe, that his family, home, and neighborhood were safe, that his society was safe. Does one's responsibility really extend that far? It certainly does, yet it is so convenient to pretend that it does not. How does one successfully initiate and maintain control? Here is a mega-truth. In the final analysis, the secret to control is always proper communication. Only when communication goes awry does it result in poor communication, then lack of control, unworkable discipline, anger, and finally punishment. The folly of the lost control, then poor discipline, then punishment sequence is readily apparent in the example of an angry parent who intentionally and forcefully injures baby John. I cannot use an animal since man is still debating whether animals should have any rights at all. Since there is general agreement that the baby is not responsible for anything, the culprit must be the adult, as there is no one else left. Although he wrings his hands, searching for some justification to escape responsibility for the act, he cannot. He chose a poor solution to his own inability to maintain control. He was wrong, and baby John was right. Later, when the baby has grown into a small child, punishment is generally permitted by society unless it's too flagrant. After all, popular opinion holds that the child must be responsible to some degree for his actions. The angry adult who strikes a small child in the course of punishment still chose a poor solution to his own inability to maintain control, but is now allowed to shift much of the blame to the child to justify the act. The parent was substantially right, and Johnny is becoming wrong. Let's imagine that as the child grows, he is often and brutally punished, as many children are. Fortunately, he survives to age 21, but then commits a serious, wrongful act. What happens now? Agreed, he is responsible for his actions, but where was society's responsibility when, as a future adult member of the group, he was getting hell beaten out of him day and night? Does society have any responsibility for the effects it allowed the child to suffer? Yes, it does, but every bit of the responsibility that society now recognizes for this member of its species would rattle for a fortnight in a thimble. The parent did his utmost to teach his child right from wrong, and that's right. So who is wrong? If there is any question in John's mind, he is about to find out. What happens when this man, a legal adult, who for years was taught to control others by inflicting injury upon them, becomes overwhelmed by life and practices what was preached? What happens, for example, when he seeks to address an out-of-control situation by angrily and brutally attacking another human being who, unfortunately, dies from the injuries? Well, as Lady Macbeth said as she wiped the blood from the dagger, what's done is done. Yet we wonder, what complex and irrational computation lurked within the dark recesses of this man's mind? What angry demons stomped and swore and screamed to him their perverted versions of right and wrong? What possible justification could exist for the merciless and savage slaughter of one human being by another? Society wonders. And one also wonders about society and its glaring lack of interest in recognizing any responsibility in the matter. What did society do that contributed to the crime? At the very least, what could a caring society have done to prevent it? Don't let any supposed mental expert who cannot cure a raw ham convince you that the act was sane. It was insane. Therefore, the perpetrator had to be insane at the time of the crime. Sane individuals do not commit insane acts. Consequently, this man, whom society failed to control, is tried, convicted, and sentenced. To what? Sentenced to be helped? Not on your life, or his. What authority exists with a workable technology to cure this victim who needs help the most? So, discipline and control having failed, and help not being available, a society that prides itself on civilized behavior angrily doles out the consequences. We will kill this confused human being in some manner that we conveniently do not consider to be cruel and unusual punishment. Nearly lost in the annals of man's great contributions to his own kind is Benjamin Franklin's discovery in 1773 that he could fry live animals with electric current, including numerous chickens, a turkey, and a small lamb. Could brotherly love be far behind? By the dawn of the 20th century, society had carefully reviewed this treatment and angrily deemed it appropriate for people whom it did not know how to help. When William Kemmler became the first human to die in an electric chair at Auburn Prison, Auburn, New York, a New York World reporter witnessed this milestone in the progress of mankind. This is what he wrote, quote, "The first electrocution by electricity has been a horror. The doctors say the victim did not suffer. Only his Maker knows if that be true. To the eye, it looked as though he were in convulsive agony. The current had been passing through his body for 15 seconds when the electrode at the head was removed. Suddenly the breast heaved. There was a straining at the straps which bound him. A purplish foam covered the lips and was spattered over the leather headband. The man was alive. Warden, physicians, everybody lost their wits. There was a startled cry for the current to be turned on again. An odor of burning flesh and singed hair filled the room. For a moment a blue flame played about the base of the victim's spine. This time the electricity flowed 4 minutes. Kemmler was dead. Part of his brain had been baked hard. Some of the blood in his head had been turned into charcoal." Unquote. Well, society looked upon what it had done and saw that it was good. Finally, capital punishment had reached a civilized state. Today, in the United States, we have finally passed laws that prevent us from executing young teenagers, but our laws still allow us to execute even the mentally retarded. And we do. So do the laws of 2 other countries on this planet, Japan and Uzbekistan. There is a lesson in this analysis of how modern man attempts to maintain order in his supposedly civilized society. You may count yourself among the many who think that children should be effectively communicated with, disciplined, and controlled. That's correct. You may also count yourself among those who think that in the absence of effective rehabilitation for criminals, and it is absent indeed, they should be promptly separated from society and efficiently controlled. That's sensible. You may even count yourself among those frustrated with an inept justice system and its bogged caseloads, coddling of criminals, and revolving door policy. Well, that's understandable. Perhaps, however, you count yourself among the many whose emotion dictates that criminals should be physically punished, emotionally battered, and made to suffer for their barbaric deeds. Let's fry the bastard. If so, that's ironic. Sir Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, spoke with great insight when he said that a society can be judged by the way it treats its criminals. You see, the only trouble with criminals is their uncivilized behavior. It's savage in intent, brutal in effect, and opposes the very meaning of the word civilized, derived from the Latin word civilis, meaning kind or courteous. Therefore, regardless of your position on the treatment of those less civil than yourself, remember this: whatever your response to your fellow man, regardless of the circumstances, if it cannot be accurately described as kind or courteous, then you cannot truthfully count yourself among the civilized either. Instead of emotionally and barbarically punishing our fellow man for his mistakes, let's help one another to fully understand the reasons for and the ramifications of his actions and to become more able, responsible, and happy. How could it be anything but a step into greater civilization? Now let's look more closely. The perpetrator of any particular crime is not necessarily known to us, but one of the victims invariably is. It's you. Man's great crime against humanity is his inability to eliminate criminality. A society of honest citizens would know and experience trust, compassion, and responsibility for its members. Where crime is allowed to fester, however, neighbor mistrusts neighbor, compassion is an unapproachable luxury, and responsibility for the well-being of others withers in the shadow of watching out for only one's own interests. Everyone suffers in a civilization that permits crime to flourish. As a member of the group, the criminal is also a victim of his own misguided acts. In fact, because criminality is a double-edged sword, he pays the dearest price of all. Through his own ignorance, he commits antisocial acts that he cannot disclose to others, that they must not discover, and thereby separates himself from the culture until, even in a crowd, in his heart he stands alone. Because we have a relentless incentive to eliminate crime for the benefit of everyone, we lavish stupendous funds upon the problem. The ranks of law enforcement officers swell. Every political candidate promises to do something effective if elected. Yet the malignancy continues and grows. Why? Because society irrationally thinks criminality must be fought, conquered, and destroyed, whereas it really needs only to be calmly and rationally understood. That man cannot control crime proves that he does not really understand it. Here is a megatruth. Nothing thoroughly understood can be a problem. The what of criminality is readily apparent. It is essentially any act of commission or omission that violates a significant public law. In other words, it is an inability to play by the rules. When the rage, fear, and suffering are stripped away, any crime is fundamentally an act of cheating. To an appreciable extent, we know the who. They are frequently identified, arrested, and sometimes temporarily separated from the society in which they have, by their own acts, removed themselves. Then they are usually released and rearrested. The where and when are not secrets either. Crimes may occur wherever humans relate. The most probable times for burglaries are Saturday nights in winter months, and if someone murders you, it will probably happen on a Friday or Saturday evening during July or August. All of these aspects are substantially known, but what has remained unknown is the why, the missing factor that would explain the actions of a human being who betrays the trust of his own kind. Frank, an imaginary example of a typical criminal, did not become a threat to his society on the day he first committed an injurious and illegal act upon another. Far from it. The seeds of a potential life of crime were nurtured during his earliest years. Frank was an unplanned and unwanted child. He was born to a minority race or suffered from some relatively minor but noticeable handicap. He stuttered, was particularly uncoordinated, or was otherwise perceived to be different by others his own age. Frank's parents argued frequently, and sometimes violently, in his presence. They often punished him as an outlet for their own frustrations and disappointments, disregarded his basic rights as a human being, and, by their actions, showed little interest in his dreams and accomplishments. He was a victim of both physical and mental child abuse. After his parents' separation, he was seldom supervised, but Frank didn't mind being ignored in the least. He had learned years before that it was easiest to survive by being unnoticed, separate, and alone. In brief, Frank did not belong to his family. His environment was one of anger, fear, punishment, and other violent behavior. Differences were resolved by force. He did not get along with either peers or adults. Frank became streetwise but poorly taught by an extremely faulty educational system. He learned by hook or by crook to get his hands on a buck, but he could not read the words printed on it. He possessed neither the will nor wherewithal to graduate from high school. Life for Frank would not get easier. Well, today Frank feels victimized, angry, and desperate. He sees his future as brief and dark. He does not see himself as part of society, but in opposition to it. He is a loner, unable to form stable relationships, and for all practical purposes is unemployable. By an elementary standard, he is unable to read or write. He is a classic example of the police profile of criminal mentality and has a rapidly expanding arrest record by age 14. Frank is not basically bad. He is an abused, confused, angry, and ignored child of society. There are not many things wrong with Frank, but what is wrong is ruinous to him and his relationships with others. A child sometimes rises from a similar environment without adopting a criminal lifestyle, while another, with the world in a handbasket, seems to succumb by choice. There are exceptions. Frank, however, has one fundamental and absolutely critical inability that society failed to address with a workable technology that made his downfall practically inevitable. It's a denominator with every person who has ever pursued a life of crime. Whether others realize it or not, he knows he is unable to effectively communicate. Frank is quite out of touch with the human race. He cannot read, write, speak, listen, or otherwise interact with other human beings with any real degree of effectiveness. How then is he going to understand and be understood? How then is he going to relate with parents, children, teachers, peers, employers, and other members of society? How then is he going to obtain and hold a decent job? Most importantly, how then is he going to care about and feel compassion for other people? Well, the answer is that he will not, and Frank does not. He is incapable of communication with, and therefore does not care about, the elderly widow whose purse he steals, the struggling divorcee whose home he burglarizes, or the teenager whose wallet and life he takes. To him they do not exist as people, but as prey. Criminal behavior exists only in the absence of responsibility for one's fellow man. A victim is one whom a criminal cannot communicate with, relate to, and therefore care about. Criminality and our inability to resolve it cannot be ignored indefinitely. Why continue what does not work? Obviously, our approach to crime is not working. Look at the facts. Crime is soaring. Compared to what it was some 30 years ago, violent crime in the United States has soared 500%. Therefore, violent crimes are 5 times as frequent. Look at the facts. Chances are that a ruthless criminal has or will set his sights on you. Current statistics indicate that at least 8 out of 10 Americans will become the victims of violent crime. Look at the facts. Prisons in 44 states are under federal order to cut overcrowding, but who wants a prison in his backyard? Look at the facts. Most violent crimes are never solved, and the average sentence for a person convicted of a violent crime is 7 years and 11 months. But how much time does he really serve? 2 years and 11 months. That does not make sense to me. How about you? According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the average time served by a person convicted of armed robbery is 2 years and 3 months. For rape, 3 years. For murder, 5 years and 6 months. Only a minuscule percentage of inmates is incarcerated for the remainder of their lives. Almost all former inmates do re-enter our communities, relocate within our neighborhoods, and walk our streets again. Most, they say, return to a life of crime. I say they never left it. Now let's look more closely at who is committing the most violent crimes. We are not dealing with a huge percentage of the population. Far from it. Statistics indicate that only 7% of the population commits over 2/3 of the violent crimes, 3/4 of the rapes, and practically all the murders. Only 7%. Furthermore, the Genius formula reveals that only about 1/3 of that number, some 2%, is of the hardcore criminal mentality, who intentionally influence others to participate in crimes in which they would not normally be involved. 2%. At this time, rehabilitation within penal systems is for all practical purposes non-existent. Instead, prisons serve a twofold system. First, to temporarily withhold from society those former members who have isolated themselves by their inconsiderate and harmful acts against others. Second, to punish inmates, thereby reinforcing the unworkable computation that problems with people are best resolved by force rather than by effective communication. Now, the first purpose, detention, is useful to both the inmates and society. The second purpose, punishment, benefits neither, and actually injures both. In truth, punishment only serves to satisfy the culture's primitive craving for revenge, while contributing to the further dehumanization of those whose only threat to society is their inhumanity. Society may curse the criminal and vehemently deny any responsibility to rehabilitate him, but it cannot and does not escape the painful consequences of that denial, which are greater than society realizes. A government's primary solution to crime is to pass more laws against it. That is ridiculous. One might as well march up to a Brahma bull, cross his arms before his chest, and order it not to charge. Criminals are not concerned about the laws. That's why they are criminals. Neither is it sensible to increase police forces endlessly. It does not work to solve the basic problem. You may catch a slightly higher percentage of the criminals, which is a low percentage at that, a small part of which will be sent to prison for a short time. But to do that, you need to finance more police, judicial expenses, prisons, guards, utilities, food, clothing, and other extensive administrative costs to accomplish what? The objective of all that is to cycle a small portion of the criminals in society through a revolving door system with no rational attempt to rehabilitate them right back into society at great expense to taxpayers. You might as well pay hard-earned dollars for someone to drag a maniac out your front door, walk him around to the rear, and hand him an engraved invitation to join the party again. The next thing you know, you will have more criminals and less money. You will also inherit a bloated and frustrated police force that is so confused by a multitude of unenforceable laws, an ineffective judicial system collapsing on itself, and a mass of disgruntled citizens that the police themselves will become part of the problem. You see it happening. Is it worth it? It does not work. Here is a megatruth. The intelligent solution to crime is to redirect the intention of the criminal while rehabilitating his ability to care about his fellow man. That does work. No one seems to know how to rehabilitate a criminal. Here is the answer as reflected by the Genius formula, and it is a megatruth. The rehabilitation of any criminal is directly proportional to increasing his ability to communicate. Have you ever listened to violent criminals attempting to communicate? Would you want to hire such an individual? Remember when I said that any crime is fundamentally an act of cheating? Why does anyone cheat at any game? Why does anyone refuse to play by the rules? The answer is that he does not have the ability to communicate successfully. Therefore, he does not have the ability to win by the rules. Therefore, he breaks the rules. Did you notice a breakdown in the 1970s in the ability of our public schools to teach Johnny to read and write? Consequently, today, some 20% of the American population is functionally illiterate. If you are following my reasoning, you won't be surprised to learn that during the last 20 years, the United States prison population has more than tripled. Incidentally, most of the prison population is going to be released soon. They are going to walk your streets. They are going to commit crimes in your neighborhood. The majority of those who are released do commit more crimes soon thereafter and are sent back to prison within 3 years to subsequently be released again. I say any school system that fails to teach its students to read, write, and speak effectively is guilty of a crime against the state. Further, any penal system that graduates its inmates back into your neighborhood without having taught them these skills, along with techniques that will enable them to relate to other humans on a basis of understanding and respect, has rightfully earned and deserves the designation criminal institution. For only when one can understand and be understood will he begin to relate honestly with and care about others. To the degree that we create, support, and promote programs within our educational and penal systems that teach effective communication among ourselves, crime will be understood, resolved, and prevented. To the degree that we shirk this responsibility, we perpetrate a significant crime of omission against ourselves, friends, and families, and mankind. We shall not escape judgment by historians of civil progress. By our deeds today, they will record that we were people of great vision, responsibility, and compassion for the least compassionate among us. Or, by our lack of concern, we shall be remembered as yet another society too blinded by anger and a desire for vengeance to stop attacking itself. Let us never pretend we don't know what to do about crime. Now we do.